Welcome to Live Daf, your online Daf Yomi Shir.
Shalom, welcome back to today's Daf, which is Eruvin Daf Nun Aleph. We are on Daf Nun Amar Beis, 2 lines from the bottom. Says the Gemara, Omar Shvisasi Bikari. The Mishnah described a case where a person's on the road and it's about to get dark. So it makes an announcement. My Shvisa, my Shabbos residence, should be established Bikari, at the trunk of that tree out in the distance. That works. That becomes his Makam Shvisa, and as a result, Mahalech Makam Raglav, Badikari, Apayamama. He can walk from his current location up until that tree, 2,000 Amma, Umikari the base, Apayamama, and from that tree, beyond, towards his home, another 2,000, Nimtza Malach Mashachashecha, Dalad Alafim Amma. So it turns out this fellow is going to walk after nightfall, 4,000 Amma, 2,000 to the tree, and 2,000 Amma beyond. Amma Rava. V'hu, this is only valid provided mati. Should he decide to run to the tree, he will arrive there prior to nightfall. That is considered to be within his reach. It can be considered as his makam shvisa. But if he can't even conceivably arrive there prior to nightfall, it's out of bounds. That can be considered his makam shvisa. Amle Abaye. The Mishnah clearly tells us it's about to get dark. Apparently he doesn't have enough time to arrive at his destination. Says Rava, sure, it's getting dark, meaning it won't allow him to get home in time. But certainly he has the ability, if he chooses to do so, to get to the trunk of the tree prior to Ben Hashmashes, which indeed is a requirement in this case. There's another version of Rava's response to Abaye's kasha. Amar Rava, ki maski kali kali. It's going to get dark even if he decides to walk leisurely. Then surely he won't arrive at the tree prior to nightfall. Aval right or ki right. But if he decides to run, to get there in a hurry, mate, certainly he will arrive at the tree prior to Ben Hashmashes. So that certainly is a requirement for us to consider that as his makam shvisa. Says in the word, there was a story of a Rava of Rav Zera, Havaka Azli Be'urcha. So Rav and Rav Zera were traveling on the road, and it was about to get dark. Amalei Rava Rav Yosef, Tei Shvisa Seinu. Rava turns to Rav Yosef and he says, our Shvisa should be Tusi Dikla de Saval Achva, underneath the palm tree, which supports his brother, supports the tree right next to it, which is leaning on it. I'm familiar with that landmark. Let us have our shvisa be established there. Some say that he described this tree as Tusi Dikla de Park Murray Mikarga. Let's establish our shvisa underneath the Dikla, this dekel that's very fruitful. It exempts its owner, the Park Murray Mikarga, from paying taxes. It produces so much fruit that provides for his taxes. So in any case, that was the tree that he had in mind. Malay, Sir Yosef responded, I'm not familiar with that landmark. Malay, Rabbi says, okay, no problem, just rely on me, and that's okay. The son, as we learned in the Brisa, this was the Brisa we learned in Daf Nun Amar Beis, Rabbi Yosef, if there were two people traveling together, Echad Makir, one is familiar with a landmark, Vechad She'eni Makir, the other one is unfamiliar. So what do they do? Zesh She'eni Makir, the person who's unfamiliar, he simply hands over, he delegates his shvisa to the other fellow, and that's okay. Zeh shemakir, the person who's familiar, Omer, he states as follows: Tei shvisa seinu makam pleni. Both our shvisa should be established at that place, and that includes both people together. So this was Rava's response. Now, he attributed this halacha to Rabbi Yossi. Says more, actually, it wasn't meant to be attributed to him. V'loi tanalik Rabbi Yossi. It wasn't stated in the name of Rabbi Yossi. He wasn't the author of this shita. So why did he mention Rabbi Yossi? To sound more convincing. So Rabbi Yosef would accept it from him, would trust him. Out on the road, he wanted to make sure that he's going to rely on him with this halacha and accept the shvisa. Because Rabbi Yossi, his words are straight like a line. They're clear, they're accepted. And therefore, he attributed to Rabbi Yossi so that this will ensure that Rav Yosef would accept the halacha and rely on the shvisa. Continues the Mishnah. Im einoi makir she'einei bakir b'halacha. So we have a case where a person is unfamiliar with a landmark, or he's unaware of the halacha that you can go ahead and make your erev from afar. So he says, well, my shvis is right here. Mishnah says he gets a tchum of 2,000 amma in all directions. Hane alpayim amma hechen ksivan. Where do we find a hint, an allusion to this concept of a 2,000 amma boundary in a pasuk? The Sanya is learned in a brayso. Shvuish tachtov. So the pasuk says a person is meant to remain in place. Shvuish tachtov, and al yetze ishmim kaimai by mashvi. A person shouldn't leave his area. So the Gemara learns this to be referring to two separate types of boundaries. The first one is shvuish tachtov, meant to stay in place. Elu arba amish. These are the 4 amish of a person, which was described back on Daf Chesam and Aleph. So a person is stuck without a tchum, he gets his personal space, 4 amish, which is the area which is required to accommodate a person. So that's the first part of the pasuk, alluding to this concept of territory. The second part, al yetzesh min kaimai, don't leave your territory. Elu al payim amma. This is in reference to the much greater territory of 2,000 amma in all directions. Menalan, where do we see 2,000 mentioned in this pasuk? Amar of Chizda, we learn it via a gzeir shava, actually a 5-tiered gzeir shava, a multiple gzeir shava. Lamadnu makim u'makim. We derive our pasuk from a different pasuk. Our pasuk that has the word makim al yetze ishmim kaimai is going to be connected to another pasuk, which contains the word makim u'makim minisa. And that pasuk, that second pasuk, which Rashi describes as being the pasuk of V'samti l'cha makim asher yonas shama, that pasuk contains the word makim and is connected to the word nisa, escaping. So we find a pasuk which connects makim with nisa. Now, if our pasuk by Shabbos has the word makim, we're going to bring over the makim in the second pasuk, which is connected to nisa. We're going to bring that over here. And we're going to say, just as in the second pasuk makim and nisa are connected, the makim by us is also meant to be related to nisa. Let's imagine as though it says nisa by us as well. So our pasuk of Shabbos contains the word nisa. Now, once we have nisa here, we go to the next step. V'nisa min nisa. And we find a pasuk that has the word nisa, that also has the word gvul. Rashi describes this as the pasuk Ir miklotoi asher yonas shama. Mikvul ir miklotoi asher yonas shama. So we have the word gvul and nisa together. Now, if by us we have the word nisa, we're going to connect it to that pasuk that has the word nisa and gvul, v'nisa migvul. So we say, well, nisa is meant to be connected to gvul, just as in that pasuk nisa and gvul are connected. Let's bring the concept of gvul over to us, because remember, it's as though it says nisa by us as well. Let's bring over the concept of gvul to us, and it's as though the word gvul is stated by us meaning in Shabbos. So that's the third step. Comes the next step, ugvul migvul. Once we have the gvul stated by us, let's connect it with Gzeir Shava to a pasuk, another pasuk, which contains the word gvul, which Rashi describes as umatza oisay goyal adam mechutz ligvul. Let's connect it to that pasuk. And since in that pasuk, which contains gvul, it also contains the word chutz, ugvul mechutz. We connect gvul to chutz. And just as over there gvul and chutz go together, likewise by us, by Shabbos, where we sort of brought over the word gvul into our pasuk, it's as though it contains gvul as well. So gvul is meant to be connected to chutz, as though it says chutz by us as well. Now, what significance does the word chutz have? So we need one more step. V'chutz mechutz. Making Gzeir Shava from the word chutz to another pasuk which contains the word chutz, which is the following pasuk. The chsiv amadoisem mechutz leir, meant to calculate, measure a territory, a boundary from outside the cities, or the cities that were granted to the Levium. So we're meant to measure their boundary as pa'as kedma payim ba'ama, the eastern edge, the eastern boundary, 2,000 amma. So we find a pasuk that contains chutz together with a boundary of 2,000 amma. So this is a source of 2,000 amma for us as well, because in our pasuk by Shabbos, we brought over all these words, and we consider the pasuk to contain the word Nisa, the word Gvul, and finally the word Chutz. And just as in that pasuk, describing the boundaries of the Levim cities, which contains Chutz and description of a 2,000 hour boundary, we bring that concept over to us as well, and we have a source that the makom of the shvisa of a person, his tchum, is 2,000 amma. Right? The point is, makom is connected to Nisa, which is connected to Gvul, which is connected to Chutz, which is connected to 2,000 amma. So our pasuk is connected to all those concepts, and we learn from there the concept of 2,000 amma. Says Rabbi, there's another pasuk describing, calculating the boundary of the Levim city, using a boundary, a territory of 1,000. And what do we learn from there? A pasuk that also contains reference to Chutz, and describing a boundary of only 1,000. V'neilef. Why don't we learn Mikira Urva Chutza? There's a pasuk also describing the measuring from outside the city of Levim, and the pasuk says Mikir Ha'ir, from the wall of the city of Chutza and outward Elefam, 1,000 amma. Where elsewhere tells us that it's 1,000 for one type of enclosure, one type of I think it's the fields, and 2,000 amma. The next 1,000 is going to be for just an open area. In any case, or maybe in the reverse, in any case, the point is that we have a concept of a territory, a boundary of a city described as merely 1,000. So what do we learn from there? Says the Gemara, we prefer the first pasuk over the second pasuk. Donan chutz mechutz. We connect our word chutz to the word chutz contained in the first pasuk describing the 2,000 amma. Ve'ein donan chutz mechutza. We prefer that over connecting chutz to a pasuk which says chutzah. It's a different spelling. Therefore, we prefer chutz over chutzah. And we connect to the pasuk of chutz describing it as 2,000. Says the Gemara, what difference does it make? When you're making Xer Shava, we don't dwell on actual spelling. The main thing is the meaning of the words. As we find in the following brayso, Hatanat Veder B'Shmuel. This is describing Xer Shava pertaining to the halacha of a nega found in a home. V'shava kohen u'ba kohen. We connect these two psukim. The kohen will return, the kohen will come to the home. And we say, just as one pasuk has a certain halacha, we connect that halacha to the next pasuk. Although the two different words is vishav and ba. Well, they both mean the same thing. The kohen's return to the home, the kohen's arrival at the home. Zui shiva, zui bia. Returning and arriving is the same thing. So apparently it's the meaning that has significance, not the actual word or the spelling. Says the Gemara, yeah, that's over there. Hani mili, that's only said hechad leka midi damile. When there's no alternative, if you don't have a better option, so certainly you connect the two things. As opposed to by us, we're faced with a choice. We have the word chutz. Should we connect it to chutz, which is similar spelling, or to chutzah, which is dissimilar? In this case, we prefer the one which is similar. When we have something which is similar, we connect it and we derive it from the pasuk which contains a word which is similarly spelled. Continues the Gemara. So we measure the tchum of 2,000 all directions. According to Chanin and Tignois, it's measured as a circle. He attains a radius of 2,000 amma. Whereas according to the Chachamim, we draw this square around him. A square of 4,000 by 4,000, which actually benefits him because he can walk the diagonal, which is much more than 4,000. The diagonal of 4,000 square is 5,600. So he gains much more. Says the Gemara, Rav Chanina ben Tignos manavshach. We have difficulty understanding Rav Chanina ben Tignos' shita. On the one hand, he seems to be learning from the Gzer Shava, from the boundary of the Tchum of the city of the Levium, to give us the din of 2,000 amma. At the same time, he's describing it as a circle, which is dissimilar to the boundary of the Levium city, which was drawn as a square. So how do we work this out? Either way, it's difficult. If he subscribes to the above mentioned Gzer Shava and he derives it from the Tchum of the city of the Levium, that gives us 2,000. Peyus Ksivan. That pasuk contains the word pa'as kedma, describing straight angles, squares. If he doesn't subscribe to that Xer Shava, apayim amma minali. If that's the case, how does he even know about the concept of 2000? So either way, things will be difficult. Do we learn from there? Let's learn all the way. It's meant to be a square boundary. If he doesn't learn from there, then where does he learn the concept of 2000? Says the Gemara, La'olam islek Xer Shava. Certainly, he subscribes to that Xer Shava, and the pasuk of the Levim's cities provide the source of the 2000 amma boundary. However, here it's different because the pasuk by the Levim says, that's the end of that pasuk that we described earlier. The pasuk includes 2000 amma territory, a straight territory with straight lines and corners. However, the pasuk includes Ze Yelahem Migushay Harim. This should be for them the area around their cities. We have a diuk, Ze. Specifically this, the cities of the Levim will have this halacha. Only to this type of situation, you will provide straight angles and corners, a square boundary. You don't provide a straight boundary l'shevse Shabbos to the resters on Shabbos. So we split the two things. Certainly when it comes to the area size, we learn from there. 2000 amma is the share of a Tchum Shabbos. When it comes to the contour, the shape of the area size, in that case we differentiate between the Levim, whose cities receive a square boundary, whereas a person on Shabbos only receives a circular boundary. V'Rabbanan, what did the Rabbanan do with this diuk of v'zeh, which seems to make that distinction between there and here? Tani Rav Chananya Omer, just the opposite. Zeh is coming to include, because Zeh you kol shevse Shabbos. All dwellers on Shabbos will attain this very quality, this very element of a square boundary which is delineated using straight lines. Since we actually have another two applications to this concept of a square territory. Amar b'acha bar Yaakov, hamar v'dal adam Yisrael. If one carries a chayfetz in Yisrael 4 amis, this is the Melacha Veitzah. Ein chayiv at shemaver hey malach soina. He will only be liable if he carries not just 4 amis. He needs to carry more than 4 amis. The diagonal of a square of 4 by 4 amis. So you imagine this virtual square in the street, 4 by 4 amis. And the only way he's chayiv is if he carries at a distance which exceeds the diagonal of that square, which is 5.6 amis. And this too is learned from the aforementioned pasuk. Kazeh, we go ahead and use a square dimension. Kazeh you call shevse Shabbos, pertaining to all the shevse Shabbos, all these halachas. It's likewise when it comes to the halacha of malacha of maver dal adam shesrabim, he can't just be maver 4 amis and be chayiv. It needs to be the diagonal of a 4 amis square. Now, what is the connection? The Balmai actually says that the concept of the malacha of maver 4 amis shesrabim, why 4 amis? Because within 4 amis is still a person's personal space. It's like a Rosh Hashanah. The chiyuv is to take something out of that Rosh Hashanah. It's not literally Rosh Hashanah, it's not surrounded, but conceptually, it's considered like person's personal space, like Rosh Hashanah. The malacha is taking something out of that area into the Rosh Hashanah, into this public area. That's why it needs to be carried 4 amis, to take it out of that personal space, out into the streets. So the point here is that we view it like a personal space versus 4 by 4 amis. So the only way he's chayiv if he carries a distance of 5.6, because if it's only 4 amis, perhaps he's carrying along the diagonal of that 4 by 4 amis square. He hadn't taken it out of that space, of that area. Therefore, it needs to be 5.6, in which case we are certain that he's taken it out of the 4 by 4 square. So anyways, that's the point here in the Gemara, that all these halachas are measured with square dimensions. And therefore, when it comes to Maver, we envision this square And the only way it's considered a malacha is if he takes it completely out of the square, as though he's walking at a diagonal, which is 5.6. Amar Papa. We have another application. Badik lan Rava. Rava challenged us with the following question. Amad Maseches Eruvin. If you have a post situated in Maseches Eruvin, Gavoya Yud, V'reichav Dal, 10 tefachim high and 4 tefachim wide. We want to consider it Rishus HaYachid, right? Because 10 high and 4 wide. In order for it to be a Rishus HaYachid, is it enough to have a diameter of 4? Could it be a circular shaped post? Is that enough? Or does it need to be a square post, 4 by 4 and square? Tzarech hein v'alachsoinen. Does it need to be square which accommodates a diagonal of a 4 by 4 tefach surface space? Meaning, does it need to be square? Oiloi, or perhaps doesn't need to be square. As long as it has a diameter of 4, even if it's round, that's also fine. And we responded to him, certainly it needs to be square. Isn't this what Rav Chananya taught us in the Brisa? The Tanya of Chananya Oime, Kazeh yiyu kol shefsei Shabbos. All dwellers of Shabbos, all lachas of Shabbos are derived from this pasuk. The same concept of square applies all over, regarding all these halachas of Shabbos. So in order for us to consider this post, the top surface of this post, like a Rishus HaYachid, it needs to have a square dimension, 4 by 4 in square. So in summary, regarding being koine shvisa, Rava taught us that if one announces his makom shvisa from afar, the only way he's koine that makom is if he can actually run over to that location and arrive there before Shabbos. We had the story with Rav Yosef. So Rav was familiar with that landmark, Rav Yosef wasn't. Rav said, don't worry, rely on me, and I'm going to establish shvisa on behalf of both of us. What is the source of the 2,000 Amat Chum? We learned it from Maseches Eruvin, from the boundary around the cities of the Levim. Rav Chanina Antinu says, we draw it as a circle. The pasuk by the Levim says, Zeh, Hilachem, Megishei Arim. Only these boundaries are meant to be drawn in straight lines, but not the Tchum of Shabbos. Rabbanan say just the opposite. Kazeyu kol shefsei Shabbos. All dwellers of Shabbos will have the same concept. Their territory will be drawn in a square manner. So we get the Tchum as a square tray, as a square 4,000 amma territory around him. This halacha applies to Tchumen, applies to the concept of a person who's carrying 4 Maseches Eruvin. We view it as though he's carrying out of a square of 4 by 4, necessitating to carry 5.6 in order to get it out completely, as though he's walking along the diagonal of that square. And likewise, when it comes to establishing Rishus HaYachid on a post which is in Maseches Eruvin, it needs to be 4 tefachim wide, but specifically a square of 4 by 4, and not merely a circle with a diameter of 4. Continues the Gemara, 2 lines from the bottom, V'zeo sha'amru, ha'ani ma'ar v'raglav. This should describe for us a person who's establishing shvisa without actually using bread, merely by announcing that this should be my makom shvisa. So the Mishnah says this is an example where the Chachamim allowed a person to make an erev b'raglav. Raglav means using his feet, through his physical presence at the site. And Rameir says, Amar Rameir, Anu ein lanu ela ani. Indeed, this only applies to an ani. A person who a wayfarer has no access to food. Only this type of person can go ahead and establish shvisa without bread. Rabbi Yehuda responded, no. Whether it's an ani or an usher, a wealthy man, he has access to food, he can go ahead and make the erev without food. So we have this machlokes, and Rameir says that ideally an erev should be established using food. Food is a person's sustenance. That's his source of livelihood. That's his makom shvisa. That's his place of dwelling. Only a person who's on the road, he's considered an ani. We allow him to do the shvisa without bread. But otherwise, if a person's back home, he's going out to make the erev, he can't do it unless he places some food there. Rabbi Yehuda says just the opposite. A personal presence is no better than that. A person's actually at the site, that becomes his place of residence. So whether he's an ani or an usher, he certainly can make the erev without bread. Now, the Mishnah described two different types of situations. One was Bim Koimi. He was actually at the site, and he said, my shvisa should be right here. We have another case where he did it from afar. He announced, my shvisa should be established right by that tree. So the question is, this machlekes between Rameir and Yehuda, whether an ordinary person who's not an ani can make his erev without bread, which case does it pertain to? Does it pertain to a case where a person is establishing his erev right here, as current location? Over there, Yehuda says, well, I'm here, I'm physically present, I can make an erev without bread. Whether an ani and usher doesn't make a difference. Whereas Rameir says, no, only if he's in a desperate situation do we allow it without bread. Otherwise, you need bread because bread is ideal. That's one option. Or perhaps the machlekes applies to even a case where he's establishing the shvisa at a distance, from afar. In that case as well, perhaps we have the machlekes. Where Rameir says only an ani can do it without bread. Yehuda maintains anybody can do it without bread. That's going to be a discussion now, Gemara. Amar of Nachman, machlekes. This discussion between Rameir and Yehuda, whether a person who's not an ani can go ahead and make the erev without using food. Rameir says no, Rabbi says yes. This discussion pertains bim koimi. When he's announcing, well, I'd like this place right here, my location, to be established as my makom shvisa. To Rameir Savar, it doesn't work if he's not an ani. Why? Ikar erev pas. Ideally, the erev is meant to use pas, bread. That's meant to be used to establish the erev. Therefore, in this case, unless he's an ani, we don't allow it to happen without bread. Ani hu de'akil rabbanon ilaway. Only an ani, the chachamim apply leniency for him to do it without bread. Aval ashaloi. But if he has access to food, he cannot establish the erev without bread, even if he's actually present at the site. Rabbi Sava, just the opposite. Ikar erev beregel. Making an erev beregel by a person's physical presence, that's actually superior than using bread. Therefore, he holds echad ani v'echad asher. Whether he's an ani or an asher, he can go ahead and make the erev without using bread by just announcing, "This is my Shabbos residence. This is my makom shvisa." So this is because he was actually present at the actual site. Avu makom ploini. But should he decide to establish a shvisa at a distance, from afar, like the other case in the Mishnah where he announced, "I'd like my shvisa to be established underneath that tree," in which case he didn't place food and he wasn't physically present there either. He just made an announcement. Divrei HaKoil all agree that will only work for an ani. Divrei HaKoil ani in asher lai. That's agreed upon by all. So according to Rav Nachman, there's a fundamental difference in approach to Rameir, who maintains that bread is a superior form of establishing an erev, whereas Rabbi Yehuda maintains just the opposite. Ikar erev beregel, physical presence, is superior. Rav Nachman says this machlekes only applies to when he's actually there at the site. Rameir says bread is required. Rabbi Yehuda says physical presence is actually superior. But if it's at a distance, in which case there's no bread, neither physical presence, all agree that's only allows for an ani who's desperate. Continues the Gemara. So in our Mishnah we had actually two statements towards the end of the Mishnah, which perhaps seem to be contradicting each other. Because on the one hand the Mishnah says this allowance of doing an erev without bread only applies to an ani. And then the Mishnah concludes by saying, well, actually, physical presence is superior to using bread. Bread is only a leniency. It's a kula to avoid troubling the wealthy man, having to have to trouble himself to go out to the makom erev. He can send some bread out. So physical presence is actually superior. So which one is it? Says more apparently reflect two different shittas. So the first statement, v'zoy amru, this allowance to make an erev without bread is only for an ani. Apparently bread is superior. Man ketanila. Who's the author of this statement? Rameir. It's Rameir who holds that bread is better. V'hayakai. And on which case is it referring to? Ayin makir. A person is on the road and he's not familiar with a landmark. Or he's not well versed in that halacha. So instead he says, well, shvisasivim kaimi. my current location should become my Makom Shvisa. And the Mishnah tells us establishing an Erev, even at a person's present location without bread, is only a leniency applied to an ani. And this is Ramei Shita. That's fine. Regarding the concluding statement of the Mishnah, which says, V'loi amru ma'arv mepas el lahakal. Only reason why the Chacham allowed using bread was to make it easier for a person, which indicates that ideally physical presence is superior and preferred. Whose Shita is this? Man Katanila. Who is the author of this statement? Rabbi Yehuda, who holds indeed that physical presence is preferred. So once again, according to Rav Nachman, there's a fundamental machlekes. You're a mayor who tells us that food is superior. Rabbi Yehuda says physical presence is superior. Machlekes only pertains to a person's actual location. He says Shvisasivim Koimi. In which case Rabbi Yehuda says only an ani can do that. Otherwise, you meant to use bread. Rabbi Yehuda says actually not. Physical presence is the best thing. But if it's at a distance, in which case there's no food nor physical presence, all agree that would only be allowed to an ani out of desperation. We have another approach to the machlekes. Rav Chizda Amar, he holds that all agree ikar eruv beregel. Physical presence is the superior method of establishing an eruv. And the machlekes in Rameir, Rabbi Yehuda, whether or not a usher, a person who's not so desperate, can make an eruv without food, applies to the following situation. Machlokes is Magam plain. When he creates an eruv at a distance, he announces, well, my shvisa will take place over there underneath that tree. So there's no food nor physical presence. That's why this is machlokes. Ramei Savar, ani in usher loy. It's only allowed for an ani out of desperation. But an usher who has access to food, he can't make a long distance shvisa because he's not physically there. So he needs to place food there. So this is only an allowance for an ani out of desperation, but an usher is meant to place food there. Rabbi Yehuda Savar, echad ani v'echad usher. Even if he's creating the shvisa from afar, he's not physically there, that's okay. Even if he's an usher and has access to food. Rabbi Yehuda holds that the fact that he's mentally connected to that place, we know where a person's mind is, that's where he is. So a person's mind, what determines matters. If he's mentally connected to that place, that's okay. So even an usher can do that. So the machlekes only pertains to an eruv from a distance. Rameh says he's not there. How can he make an eruv? So that's only a kula applied to an ani out of desperation. Rita says the fact that he's connecting himself there mentally, that's okay, and can be done even by an usher. Aval b'mekaymi, but if he's actually present at this site, this is going to be my eruv site. Divrei hakol echad ani v'echad usher. Whether it's ani or usher, that's okay. The ikar eruv beregel, because all agree. Ramei and Rabbi both agree. Creation of an eruv via physical presence at the site is actually preferred. So all agree that in all situations, ani and usher, this is fine. Let's get back to those statements in the Mishnah. V'zoi she'amru, the Mishnah says, well, allowing a person to make an eruv without using food only applies to an ani. Who is the author of that statement? Man Katanila, Rav Meir. It's Rav Meir speaking, and he's referring to the case where he's doing a long distance eruv from afar. Which case is referring to? On the case of Misha Baba Derech V'chashcha, it's getting dark, and he's familiar with a landmark out in the distance, and he announces, my eruv should be established there. So since it's from afar, he's not physically there, Rav Meir maintains, this will only allow for an ani, but not for an usher. Regarding the conclusion of the Mishnah, which says, V'loi amru ma'arvim b'pas el lahakal. The only reason Chacham allowed using bread for the eruv was to make it easier for the person, as so not to trouble him, to have to go out to the eruv site. This is agreed upon by all, because this indicates that what's the preferred manner of establishing an eruv? Physical presence. All agree to that. Rameh and Ravida both agree that ikar eruv is a regal. Man Tanil, who is the author of this statement? Divrei hakol. It's agreed upon by all. So in summary, can a person who is an usher, meaning he has access to food, make an eruv without using pas? We have machlekes Rameh and Rabbi Yehuda. Rav Nachman's approach is, Rameh holds Iker Erev is Bapas. Bread is a superior form of establishing an Erev. Therefore, he says, a person who's an usher must use bread. Without bread, it won't work. Whether he's making the Erev Bim Kaimi right here in his current location or at a distance, Makim Plani. According to Rabbi, just the opposite. Iker Erev Beregel. Personal presence is a superior form of establishing the Makim Shvisa. Therefore, he maintains if it's Bim Kaimi, if he's doing it right here, certainly it works. But if it's at a distance, Makim Plani, where he's not actually present, even according to Rabbi, it wouldn't work. So we have two chumras. According to Rameh, even Bim Kaimi, it doesn't work. It was meant to use bread. And even according to Rabbi, if it's Makim Plani at a distance, it won't work either. Rav Chiz's approaches all agree. Iker Erev Beregel, physical presence, is superior. Therefore, according to Rameh, Bim Kaimi, if it's right here that he's establishing the Erev, it works. If Makim Plani, it doesn't work. Rabbi Yehuda maintains, whether he's doing it Bim Kaimi, right here in his current location, or even Bim Makim Plani, from afar, there as well it works, because he's mentally connected to that location, that becomes his Makom Shvis. So Rav Nachman espouses two chumres. Number one, that according to Rav Meir, even if it's Bim Kaimi, the Shvis is taking place right here, it doesn't work. Number two, that even according to Rabbi Yehuda, if it's from afar, Makom Plani, it won't work as well. Continues the Gemara. Tanya Kavaseder Rav Nachman. We have a brayso in support of Rav Nachman on both accounts. Number one, that according to Rav Meir, even Bim Kaimi doesn't work. And number two, according to Rabbi Yehuda, Makom Plani won't work. The brayso begins with the sheet of Rav Meir. Echad ani v'echad asher. Whether ani or asher, ma'arv mepas. We insist they make their Erev using bread, which is the preferred method. The usher cannot go out to the edge of the boundary there and announce that my shvisa will be established right here. So even if he's actually there at the site, it doesn't work for an usher. This concept of allowing an Erev to be established beregel without bread is only applied to a desperate situation, to a person on the road, a wayfarer. But otherwise, if he's an usher coming from home, he can't establish a shvisa without bread. Divrei Rav Meir. So we see clearly Rav Meir holds, if he's actually there at the site, he's going out to the tchum, he's saying shvisa mikami, it won't work because he's an usher. So this supports the first chiddush of Nachman, Rav Meir's machmer, even in this case. Continues the brayso. We're going to have a raya regarding the second chumrah. That even according to Rabbi Yehuda, for a person to make an Erev, for an usher to make an Erev without bread, that's only allowed when he's actually present at the site. But from afar, he cannot do so. Rabbi Yehuda Omer, Echad ani v'echad asher, ma'arv beregel. Whether an ani or an usher, they have the ability to make the Erev beregel just by their mere physical presence. Because according to Rabbi Yehuda, Iker Erev beregel, this is the preferred method of establishing your residence. How does he go about doing this? Says Rabbi Yehuda, v'yetzi asher chutz l'tchum. Says the usher leaves his home and he should go out to the edge of the boundary, to 2,000 mark. V'yoymar te'shvisasim m'koymi. I should announce my shvisa will be established right here in my location. V'zehu ikari shel erev. This is the actual preferred method of making an erev. So when Yehuda describes the usher as making an erev without bread, how is he describing it? Not from afar, not from a distance. He insists that he actually goes out there and says Shisasrim Kaimi. So apparently, even according to Yehuda, that's the only way an usher could do it without bread. But should he decide to do it from afar, even if Yehuda would agree it doesn't work. But he's not physically there. This is a raya to Rav Nachman. Continues the brayso. So although the Iker Erev is beregel, nevertheless Chacham allowed a person to use bread for convenience sake. They allowed the homeowner, the Maseches Eruvin, to send his bread, biad avdoi, with his servant, biad bnoi, with his son, biad shlucha, with his shliach, b'shvil hakalov, to make it easier for him. But ideally, an erev is meant to be done through a person's physical presence. Rabbi Yehuda says, I'll prove to you that even an usher can make an erev without using bread, provided that he's physically present at the site. Masa ba'anshe beis mamol, u'ba'anshe beis gurion, was a story involving the people of Beis Mamol and the people of Beis Gurion, ba'aroima, in this place called Aroima. It was a time of famine, and they were distributing food on Shabbos. Sheimachalkin grois, they were distributing dried figs, vitzimukin, and raisins, la'aniyim, b'shnei betzeris, in a time of famine. Now, they were doing it on Shabbos, and some poor people wanted to come and receive this allotment. Uboyin aniyah kfar shichen, and the fellows living in Kfar Sichen, v'aniyah kfar Chananya, and from Chananya, would go ahead. Umach shichen al atchum. So these towns were about 4,000 am away from the place of the distribution, let's say. It was about 4,000, which could be accessed through an Erev. So they would come along to the Tchum, the boundary between the two locations, and wait there until nightfall, which would establish an Erev for them. And this would allow them to come tomorrow. Next day they would get up and come. So apparently even a person who's coming from home, who's an usher, is allowed to establish an Erev Tchumen without using bread, provided he's physically there. This is Rabbi Yehuda's raya to his shita. Okay. Amar Rav Ashi, the following Mishnah on Daf Nun Beis Amud Aleph would actually provide a raya as well to Rav Nachman, who maintains that even according to Rabbi Yehuda, who says an usher can make an Erev without bread, that's only provided he's actually present at the site. That becomes his Makom Shvisa. But if it's at a distance, it's from afar, even he would agree that he can't do so. What is the raya? The Tanya Mishnah says like this: Misha Yotza Leilech Le'ir Shem Arvan. This fellow had a house in this city, a home in another nearby city as well, which was within 4,000 amma, meaning they can go from one to the other by establishing an Erev. This fellow left the first town, was on the way to the second town. He wanted to spend Shabbos there. He met his friend along the road, who turned it back. He says, look, it's bad weather, a snowstorm, go back home. But he really wanted to have access to the other city on Shabbos. So what's halacha? Hu mutalelach. He's allowed to go there. We assume that he wanted to establish a Makom Shvisa right in between both cities. So that becomes his Makom Shvisa. It becomes his Erev. And allows him to walk from one city to the other. V'chol b'nei Eir. However, all the other dwellers of the first city cannot walk to the second city, even though they made an announcement, explicit announcement saying, well, we'd like to establish our Shvisa right in the middle of those two towns. Divrei Rabbi Yehuda. So there's a difference between him and them. He can walk and they can't. We asked the kasha, why is he different than them? Why can he walk and they can't? We're speaking about a case, Kigoyin, for instance, Sheyesh Shnei Batim. He has two homes, one home in either town. Ushnei Tchumei Shabbos B'neim. There are two Shabbos boundaries between the two cities, meaning, let's say there are 4,000 amma in between. So he has established an Erev Tchumen, which allows him to walk. Why? Iyu, this fellow, Kiva Denafkele L'Urcha, since he set out on a journey, Havali Ani, he is regarded like an Ani, because he's on the road. Therefore, he has the ability to establish Shvisa even from a distance, without using bread. In accordance with Shittas Rabbi Yehuda. However, the dwellers of the town, they're considered like a shir, and they're back home. They have access to food. And therefore they cannot establish Shvisa without placement of bread when it's being done at a distance. Apparently, we learn from this, that if a person chooses to establish Shvisa from afar, without using bread, that's only allowed for an ani. Ani in. Asher loy, but not for an asher. Shmamina. Indeed, this is a raya. This supports Rav Nachman's contention that even according to Rabbi Yehuda, who says that an usher can go ahead and establish Shvisa without bread because Ikar Erev Beregel, but that only applies when he's there at the current location, at the actual Makom Shvisa. But if he's doing it from afar, in which case he's not present at the Makom Shvisa, it won't work. Continues the Gemara. Masnile Rav Chia bar Ashi. Rav Chia bar Ashi taught L'chia bar Rav, L'chia the son of Rav, Kamed Rav, in the presence of Rav. Echad ani, v'echad asher. Whether he's an ani or an asher, he can go ahead and establish Shvisa without using bread. Amalei Rav. So Rav, who was the father, responded, to Rav Chiya bar Ashi, Sayim Bonami, you should conclude as well with the following conclusion. Halacha Rabbi Yehuda. You should conclude your halacha by saying halacha Rabbi Yehuda. We follow Rabbi Yehuda's shita, who holds that indeed even an usher can establish a shvisa by his mere physical presence, but it needs to be at the actual site, Milkaimi. But from afar, he cannot do so. Rabba bar Rav Chanan have a ruggle. He was accustomed, the Asi, to travel mir Tivna the Pumbedisa. He would go from Tivna, one town, to the other town, Pumbedisa, on Shabbos. And there was a distance, a great distance between the two towns. He would travel by use of an Erev. And what would he say? Va'amar, he would sit at home and make an announcement. Teishvisase b'tzinsa. So on Erev Shabbos, he would say, my Makam Shvisa should be established in this place called Tzinsa. Now, he was home. He's considered an usher. Nevertheless, he's making an Erev from afar without placement of bread. Amalei Abaye, my daitach. So Abaye asked him, what do you think? Because you're following Shitas, Rabbi Yehuda. Rabbi Meir, Rabbi Yehuda, whenever we have a machlokes between Rabbi Meir and Rabbi Yehuda, halach Rabbi Yehuda. And therefore, you allow yourself to make an Erev at a distance without placement of bread. V'am Rav Chizda, machlokes is complaining. And according to Rav Chizda's approach, that the discussion between Rabbi Meir and Rabbi Yehuda pertains to making an Erev at a distance. And even there, Rabbi Yehuda allows the usher to establish a shvisa without placement of bread because he's mentally connected to that location. So is this the shita that you're following and allowing yourself to do it? For Rav Nachman, but we have the approach of Rav Nachman. But Tani Kavasei, we have a brayso which supports Rav Nachman. That what? That even according to Rabbi Yehuda, an usher cannot establish a makom shvisa without bread if he's not actually present at the Erev site. So how can you do that? Omar lei. So Rabba bar Rav Chana responded, indeed, Hadrabi, I revert. I won't do it any longer. Okay, time for a brief review of today's daf. We learned several halachas regarding Kinyan Shvisa. Rabba taught us that if one announces his makom shvisa from afar, the only way he's koina that makom is if he can actually run over to that location and arrive there before Shabbos. We had the incident with Rabba and Rav Yosef, where Rabba was familiar with the landmark and he did the shvisa on behalf of both of them. We learned the source of the Alpayim Amma being a Tchum Shabbos from a multiple Gzera Shava, which led us to the pasuk describing the boundaries drawn around the cities of Levim, which were drawn with using right angles. And Rochanina and Tigna says, the pasuk says Zeh, which indicates only those boundaries are meant to be delineated using right angles and straight lines, as opposed to Tchum Shabbos, which are meant to be drawn agules, around a person, a radius of 2,000 amma. Rabbanan maintain just the opposite. The pasuk over there says Zeh, which indicates others should be just like this. All matters pertaining to Shvisa Shabbos, for instance, Tchumen, for instance, carrying 4 amas to Seruvin, that also is connected with the concept of a square area. So 4 amas means the diagonal of a 4 amas square, which means 5.6 amas. Only then is a person chayiv for carrying a chayfetz to Seruvin. And likewise, another application would be a amad which is Seruvin. We have a post sitting which is Seruvin 10 tefachim high, 4 tefachim wide. It's not enough that it has a diameter of 4 tefachim and is shaped like a circle. Rather, it needs to be at least 4 by 4 in square. If a person chooses to make an erev without bread, and he's an usher who has access to food, he's not on the road. We have a machlekes. We turn Rav Meir Rav Yehuda. Rav Nachman's approach was a more stringent approach. He maintains that there's a fundamental difference in approach between Rav Meir, who maintains that Iker Erev Pas, the primary method of establishing an Erev Tchumen, is by using bread. Therefore, he says, an usher who has access to bread cannot establish an Erev without Pas, whether he's doing it at his current location from Kaimi or from afar. Rabbi Yehuda holds Iker Erev Beregel, the superior method of establishing an Erev is by physical presence. Therefore, he says, if he's actually present at the site, Bim Kaimi, he can do so, even if he's an usher. At a distance, he cannot, because he's not physically present at that location. So you have 2 chumras according to Rav Nachman. Number one, according to Rameh, even Kaimi it won't work. According to Rabbi Yehuda, even according to Rabbi Yehuda, if Makim Pliny it won't work. Rav Chizda maintains, all agree, Ikar Eruv Beregel. The primary method is by physical presence. Therefore, Rameh maintains, if he's actually there, if it's Bim Kaimi, it's right here, then certainly he can do so. If it's at a distance, it won't work. Whereas the reader maintains, whether it's Bim Kaimi, it's going to work, and even Makim Pliny, it will work, because he's mentally connecting to that location. The Gemara concluded, Halacha follows Rav Yehuda's Shita in accordance to Rav Nachman's approach, and therefore, if a person is an usher, he'd like to make an Eruv, he can do it if he's actually present at the site. So he can do it even without placing food, but he cannot do that at a distance. In that case, he needs to send some food out there to establish his Eruv.